PGS 7 and 8 are just a couple of days away, and that of course means that it's time for everyone on the internet to tell us their predictions, show us their tier lists, tell us who's gonna win the event. And as much as I love speculating just as much as the next guy, it gets a little stale to have to predict multiple events when it's like all the same teams literally a week apart. And so while I will be giving you some sort of predictions, I'm going to be switching it up a little bit, and if you've read the title, you already know what is happening. So without further ado, welcome to my way too early predictions for PGC 2025. First things first, if we're going to predict PGC, we need to understand how the teams are going to get there. What will be their path to make it to the event? So let's have a quick look at the PGC seed distributions, where things have been slightly reshuffled from previous years. This time, every single qualifying region has 5 slots, with the exception of Korea. Still going to be the top 8 teams in terms of PGS performance that will make it to PGC as well. And that is regardless of region. So these 5 seeds that have been allocated to various regions could be exponentially more depending on how well those teams perform at PGS and EWC. Crucial thing to note, normally we would be really excited to see a 32 team PGC, but this time they've switched it up once again and added in a wildcard slot for the host nation, but not into the normal 32 as it would typically be, but directly to the finals as an additional seed, which means the group stages only 15 teams will qualify, and then the host nation will have guaranteed representation in the finals. My immediate thought on seeing this news was that this hints heavily towards Korea being the host nation for PGC, because that evens up the slots for basically every region. But with Korea now being announced as the host nation for Nations Cup, maybe that's not true. Maybe it could be somewhere in Southeast Asia again, maybe like a Brazil. That would be cool. But that wildcard spot is going to have implications for my way too early prediction, so I'm going to have to predict where it is as well. But we'll get into that later, because first we're going to talk about the PGS point system and how the teams are going to be using them to qualify. So this is a screen full of just, like, frankly, way too many numbers for you to care about. But essentially, this is the point distribution for all of the PGS events, including 7 and 8, which will be happening over the next couple of weeks. Interestingly, PGS 7 and 8 have the exact same points distribution because they're coming earlier in the year, and the points do ramp up as the year progresses. So PGS 9 is worth more than PGS 8, but PGS 10 is worth even more than PGS 9. So the closer you are to PGC when you start winning your tournaments makes a massive impact on how many points you get. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that PGS 7 and 8 are less valuable in terms of PGC, because if you perform well now, you're much more likely to get one of the invite spots to the Esports World Cup, where you can compete for the PGS points at that event, as well as like the just frankly insane prize pool that always gets thrown out at EWC. Speaking of which, the invites to EWC will be based on the new updated OPGG rankings, where this time it's maybe a little bit more clear on how the points work than the weird obscure Twire system last year, but it's still not great. Now admittedly, this screenshot was taken like a week ago before they made a couple of changes, but there are still things that are just drastically wrong with this. For example, why the hell is TSM still here? Teams that have gone through roster changes just haven't really been fully updated, and you know, it's kind of reflected somewhat in some of the standings. Like TSM was top 7, but Team Liquid is 68th. Petrichor Road, who just like dominated in China, is in 12th position. Virtus Pro is behind teams like Gen G or Ascend. There's a lot of question marks around how this whole thing is going to work, but hopefully during PGS 7 and 8, some of the kinks get ironed out. Currently, there is a massive lead for all of the top 6 teams, who are mostly GPT teams, with the exception of FaZe, who crucially at this point are no longer a GPT and therefore no longer qualified for PGS. So if these rankings remain kind of the way that they are, there is a massive opportunity for teams like the Expendables, Daytrade, Teraton 5 to try and close that gap. Not to mention some of the other teams who are slightly further down the questionable rankings, like Petrichor Road or Virtus Pro. They could have massive jumps as well. But in order for them to get those massive jumps, they're going to have to perform well at PGS events. Let's take a look at how that works. So with PGS 7 coming up like literally tomorrow by the time this comes out, probably, you should hopefully all fully understand how this works. But if not, 24 teams will be competing in group stages for 3 days and then a 3-day grand final. 10 global partner teams from around the world will be featured alongside those who successfully made their way through qualifiers. And honestly, just looking at the sheer lack of qualifier slots for each region, those things are really tough. Basically, if you're not a GPT, you have to be top 3 in your region, otherwise you simply are not going, and that is extremely hard to do consistently. Compared to previous years, this is slightly different. EMEA has gained one slot for the qualifiers, but balanced out with the loss of FaZe as a GPT, whereas Korea, now with an additional global partner team in DN Freaks, has absorbed one of the slots that used to belong to APAC, which all in all does kind of balance things regionally, but there's a whole conversation about regional slots versus national slots and how Korea has the same amount of seeds as APAC, which is like 30 countries. Not to mention EMEA is representing like 50 as well. But all in all, I don't think anyone's too upset with this. Getting an extra open qualifier slot for EMEA is cool. It is a shame that it means we won't have FaZe, but I mean, should have probably just qualified, I guess. But unfortunately, they didn't. So let's have a look at some of the scenarios for how PGS 7 and 8 might go for the teams that did qualify, and the list of global partners with a couple of changes from previous years. The Expendables now stepping up as a global partner after winning PGC, E-Arena taking over the spot of Daytrade from last year, and DN Freaks now global partner as well, giving us 2 global partner teams from Korea. And honestly, maybe part of the reason why they kind of standardized the amount of regional slots is just so the graphic looks nicer, so they can kind of make a nice square. There's just like one irritating gap where there's only 2 PCL teams, but never mind. But let's take a look at how some of the groups will be going, starting off with Group A. Now, I have to say this group is probably one of the least impressive groups I've seen at a global event, maybe ever. New Happy have just not looked good since the roster changes that were made. Gen G and Begopar are just not expected to perform well, especially since Begopar once again qualified with PO, but then can't actually use him at the event. And then also 4 AM. But there are definitely some high points in this group. Team Falcons, previously Sonics, are expected to come through and just practically dominate. But don't count out Theraton 5 too quickly, the team that won the overall APAC qualifiers. They've been looking really strong since they found their feet after making some roster changes last year. And they're in with a big opportunity of getting that direct slot to EWC if they perform well at PGS 7 and 8, given their current position on the OPGG rankings. So there's a lot for them to play for, but overall I would probably expect not to see many more than maybe 3, possibly 4 at a push of these teams to make it into the grand finals. Group B is slightly stronger overall, but with a little bit more unpredictable in terms of the form. Sometimes some of these teams could come out and be world beaters, look like the best in the world. I mean, this group literally has the Expendables, who's like a world champion, but also sometimes just like non-existent. And it's really the same story for a team like 17 Gaming. Sometimes they can come out and push a team like Twisted Minds to the very limit, take them all the way, make it a 1v1 for the championship, or sometimes they might just fail to qualify for a finals, which Twisted Minds are themselves guilty of. Not just sometimes that they fall short in the finals, but they've even missed a grand finals at EWC last year. So while they are generally extremely consistent and no doubt extremely talented, they're not completely infallible. That said, I would expect this group to generally have better success in terms of qualifying to the finals, but a lot of them may be in kind of the mid-pack, sort of that 8 to 16 slot. Teams like Furia, Daytrade, and TKL, they really could go either way as to whether or not they get into the grand finals or not. Furia had a really good run in the PAS series. Daytrade have been up and down. TKL at one point looked like they might be contesting for a PCL title, but then there was ebbs and flows in the form, just kind of came back to bite them. Maybe a shorter tournament format like this, where the group stage is only going to be 2 days of games, might work in their favor, but it's a big coin flip. However, if we want to see some consistency, look no further than Group C, because the potential top end of this group is absolutely out of this world. Undeniably elite teams. Clear champion of PWS, clear champion of PCL. Teams like Virtus Pro, who have been consistently performing to an extremely high standard. GK Esports, another fresh roster, but still put it together with enough talent and cohesion to win the title in EMEA. And with the organization of GK, they have a massive incentive to work really hard to qualify for EWC as well. From there, the remainder of the teams are meh. Sometimes E-Arena can look really good. Sometimes Forest can look really good. They have a very similar, very safe, conservative style of play, but just a couple of bad zone shifts can really dictate whether or not they'll make it into the finals. But I would be absolutely shocked if there wasn't at least 4 teams from this group getting into the grand finals. So now that we roughly have an idea of which teams to expect to make the grand finals at PGS 7 and 8, it's time to introduce you to the spreadsheet. Because as I've been bored with nothing better to do, I put together a spreadsheet which can automatically track tournament positions and estimate where they will place overall in the PGC PGC point rankings. Let me give you a little demonstration, show you what I mean. So here we have the spreadsheet. Essentially what this is some of my nightmare fuel that kept me up for multiple nights while I tried to figure out how the fucking index match works. But what we ended up with is something that is actually really cool, I think. And it's actually surprisingly simple too. All that we have to do is come down to this bottom left table. So if we take, for example, 17 Gaming, and we estimate that they'll be finishing, let's say, 4th at PGS 7 and 7th at PGS 8, we enter those positions. It automatically checks the position, checks the event, and checks the points value, and adds it to the totals table on the right-hand side. Maybe that's enough to qualify them for EWC. So let's say they make it to EWC and come 5th, and EWC's 5th place points is added in. We can then go through, we can begin to sort of populate the table up with some positions. Just go a little at random. And you can kind of see how just as it goes through, it is tracking the position per tournament, assigning the points value, and then totaling it all up on the right. So we'll be using this to predict which teams I think will do well at which events, and how things are looking at the end of the year when it comes down to the PGC slots that are assigned to PGS points. Shout out to James for helping me figure out how to make this work, and thanks to him and his knowledge of spreadsheets, here's one I made earlier. So what I've done at this point is I've gone through some of the regional qualifiers and looked for teams who I expect, while they didn't qualify to PGS 7 or 8, they have a good chance of making it to tournaments further down the line. For example, teams like FaZe Clan, All Gamers Global, and then I've gone and made some predictions for how they will perform throughout the year. Important to note that there is only PGS points available for teams that qualify to the grand finals. So functionally in the table, there is no difference between not making the grand finals at an event and not qualifying to the event at all. Either way, you get a DNQ, which is 0 points. So for some of the mobile users out there, you might be able to see the numbers if I zoom in, and you can see that I have teams like 17 Gaming expected to have quite an up and down year. Teams like Daytrade being relatively inconsistent, sometimes making it to grand finals but not having the greatest impact. eArena kind of building up throughout the year as they go, getting a little more consistent. And of course the DN Freaks just shitting on everyone. Between themselves, Falcons, Expendables, and Twisted Minds, I'm expecting there to be a very big year for some teams. If we scroll down a little, I took a look at some of the regional qualifiers to try and find teams who could potentially qualify further down the line for different events. And while there's a lot of DNQs and it's looking grim, a big part of that is because of the fact that you don't get points if you don't make it to the grand finals. So while I think there's a definite non-zero chance that many of these teams could make it to EWC or to PGS 9 and 10, I just don't really see them having a big enough impact to get to the grand finals overall. That said, the big exception to that is down here with Team Liquid. I have them qualifying to every event later down the line this year and getting top 8 at all of them. And then you have a little more sporadic teams like TDT, NIP, CTG, and of course FaZe Clan and AGG, who are both kind of big surprises that they didn't qualify to this event. And the result of all of that baseless speculation is this list. This is my projected PGS points for the entirety of this year, and because I'm not an absolute psychopath, I did not build a table to try and do something similar for regional points, because the PGC points format for PWS would make my head explode. So I've simply taken the lazy way out and assigned the regional slots to the teams that perform best at PGS, which generally, if you're qualifying to the international events, you're probably performing well regionally as well. So maybe it's not that outrageous, with the exception of maybe some GPTs that underperform regionally. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. So feel free to pause here if you want to look through a little bit more detail at my predictions for where the teams will perform. And if you want to type any comments and call me an idiot for thinking that, then cool. But in the interest of time and keeping things simple, this is how things actually look in terms of the regional qualifications. A team like GSW currently has a big lead, but there's a chance later on down the line that some of these other teams could overtake. APAC is a total shit show, with the same points being allocated to Vietnam Series, Thailand Series, and the PMS. It feels kind of insane that going up against teams like Daytrade Gaming, Teraton 5, and Forest gives you the same amount of points as going up in a region where you're playing against teams like Happy Squad. No disrespect, but like, come on. In the PWS, DN Freaks ran over everyone so hard that literally anyone could just have a newborn baby and put them at a PC and they would have a chance of qualifying. And because the format is so cooked with all the additional points and the daily points, I cannot be arsed looking into this any further than this graphic. And EMEA is nice and straightforward, points just going on all the way down. We're expecting to see quite a few of these EMEA teams secure some of the PGS slots. So the battle for the EMEA places at PGC could actually be really intense, with teams teams really only going to be separated by 4 or 5 points, and potentially even have tiebreakers that could be decided somehow. I don't really know what the tiebreaker is. Probably the most recent event. So PEC fall will have big implications for PGC if those EMEA teams can perform at PGS events. And PAS is very similar to the EMEA series as well, with the big kicker being that the South American teams have a massive head start over so many of the teams that were projected to do very well out of North America. So there could definitely be a massive Brazilian and Argentinian presence at PGC, which was something that was sorely lacking last year. So I would be very happy to see it. That said, big shout out to Subsidite, who did all the complicated maths and figured out that DN Freaks mathematically cannot fail to qualify to PGC. Not that they would be expected to, but that is already one Korean slot guaranteed off the board, and most likely they'll be getting a PGS point slot as well, so it will push down into the absolute bloodbath brawl that is everyone else in Korea, where teams are already separated by like 4 or 5 points, and with their stupid ass points format, it could literally go to anyone. But my overall sheet has the 8 PGS slots locked in, as well as all of the regionals, including the wildcard seed. I've nicely color-coded the table on the right-hand side for you so you can see the separation between different regions when it comes down to PGS points. However, there is one team that's going to be a 0-pointer who's going to make it to PGC, and that is entirely dependent on what the location of PGC actually is. So, without further ado, I introduce you to my way too early prediction for who will qualify for PGC 2025. In the PGS point seeds, in order from 1st to 8th, we have DN Freaks with what is expected to be an absolutely dominant year, closely followed by Twisted Minds, Petrichor Road, and Falcons. Na'Vi as well, consistent across many events, generally will be top 4, maybe even towards the top 5. Expendables a little bit more of a wild card. They could have a couple of not too great tournaments, but 1 or 2 big top 3 placements will get them here. Virtus Pro as well, another team that's expected to do very well. And lastly, 17 Gaming with a bit of an up and down year, but it's enough to squeeze them in a PGS point slot. The rest of the teams are sort of there, so feel free to pause and check who you think they are. But the most exciting part of all of this is my prediction for the host nation, because now that Korea is off the board, and as much as I would love to see an event held in South America, I just don't really see Brazil as an option in PUBG at the moment. So I anticipate that we will once again be going back to Southeast Asia. Now, the big caveat here is that every time we've done an event in Southeast Asia, the company Hero Esports, or VSPO as you may know them, who runs the production at all of the PUBG events, has an offshoot of their company in the location where the event is held. For example, PGS 7 and 8 in Shanghai is literally held at their main head office in Shanghai. There is also VSPO Thailand, who was helping to organize the production with PGS 5-6 last year, and during PGC last year held in Malaysia, a big part of that was played by the same production company who ran the APAC qualifiers that I was involved in leading up to this event, which is, of course, Hero Esports Malaysia. So logistically speaking, it makes sense that they go for these places where they already have production staff and equipment already on location, so they don't have to pay to transport equipment and staff or hire it locally. However, I can see that there might be a little bit of fatigue of constantly having events held in the same locations. As much as I love going to the events in Thailand, I've been to every single event that's been held in Thailand and I've had a fantastic time every time. A little bit of variety would be cool. And I think PUBG is a popular enough game that you could host events in a lot of regions of Southeast Asia, and even if it's not necessarily a PUBG PC focused audience, the PUBG mobile player base is so big that people would probably just show up anyway. I would love to see an event held somewhere like Japan, but that would almost certainly be way too expensive. Vietnam would be unbelievable to host an event, but unfortunately there are government restrictions that hold that back from actually occurring. And so this year I have made a selection, and my prediction for the venue of PGC 2025 is we are heading to Indonesia. Now, hear me out, it might sound pretty wacky and out there, but Indonesia has played a big part in things like Nations Cup. They've been pretty steady contenders. With Nations Cup now coming back bigger, they're involved in that again. They have their own leagues and production companies. There's definitely a fan base there, and the population is like insane, so filling a venue wouldn't be a problem. There's also no government restrictions on PUBG, so there wouldn't be too much of an issue with hosting an event. But the key crucial factor for me, which makes this an interesting choice at worst, is the fact that Indonesia is planning on moving their capital city of Jakarta to a brand new location in Borneo. A city by the name of Nusantara is in the process of becoming the new Indonesian capital city, and for that reason there may be interest from the Indonesian government to assist with some of the costs of starting to get events happening there, to get interest for people not just locally but also tourism, anything that they can really do to boost income into the new region and start to build it up as something of an internationally recognized hub would actually be a pretty interesting thought. Yes, while to my knowledge there is no VSPO or Hero Esports offshoot in Indonesia, there may be an opportunity to come to some sort of arrangement to help to cover some of the costs of transporting or hiring equipment, and frankly, it's just a change of scenery. So with all of that real world political stuff said, my prediction for the host nation is Indonesia, which will mean that the direct grand finals slot for the host nation will go to Kiwa Esports, which is a rebrand of the team that was FTF or Bleed or the Indonesia Nations Cup roster from a year or two ago. So this is my final 33 teams for PGC 2025, but how will the actual event itself play out? Well, here are my predictions for exactly that. Here we have the 16 teams that I predict will be competing in the PGC finals at the end of this year. I think there aren't too many teams here that would surprise people, with the obvious exception of Kiwa Esports as the host nation. But I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of liking the way that this is looking. Potential rogue picks could be the obvious one being Gen G. I often find that no matter how much throughout a year Gen G tend to suck, they always still find a way to qualify for these big events. I am putting my faith, my belief in Furia being able to maintain their standard of play throughout the year, and the same thing for GK Esports as well, which may already be in slight jeopardy with the news that Diffex hasn't traveled to Shanghai to compete at PGS 7. So hopefully whatever issue has arisen there can be resolved, and we can see that roster compete internationally at full strength. But a big bounce back for teams like FaZe Clan and Team Liquid, who failed to qualify for PGS 7 and 8, as well as All Gamers Global, who is a team that many people predicted would just dominate in Vietnam and APAC, but I always had my reservations about that team. One of the main concerns I had was when they first signed the roster and they had 6 players, trying to figure out how they would balance that roster, how they would rotate between players. They cut down on that issue by trading Zest over to Cerberus, but still a 5-player roster with developing and young talent is always a bit of a concern. And with the recent news that Surti has stepped down and left the roster, that means AGG will be continuing this year with a roster of Himas, Tycon, Destroy, and Hudat, all absolutely outrageous fraggers. And when they were playing with this roster in preseason tournaments against teams from China and Korea, they were dropping like 19 kill wins for fun. Obviously, there are some concerns there about who will be playing a supportive role, who will be taking over IGLing duties. IGLing duties would most likely go to Destroy, with him having some experience as a team captain for Unicorn Cyber. But again, he's a young player. He doesn't have as much international experience, but I think just the raw firepower that team has is enough to get them over the line regardless. A tough event for a team like Teraton 5. Foot Esports once again qualifying just to PGC at the very end of the year. And for the most part, I have the global partner teams will be qualifying to the grand finals with a couple of exceptions. Obvious one being 4AM. E-Arena falling short towards the end of the year as well. Honestly, predicting who even gets to PGC is difficult, but then predicting how well they perform is just so tough because it's a whole lot of new rosters that we just haven't seen play internationally. So there's no real basis to compare or contrast the teams against each other. But this is literally called way too early predictions. This is what I signed up for. So with that said, this is how I predict this grand finals lobby will play out. A bottom 8 of Kiwa Esports, obviously, Gen G, also quite obvious. And as for the rest, it's teams that have one way or another looked inconsistent throughout the year. Some teams that have started off on an extreme high, like GK and Furia, winning their respective regional series, but may just struggle to maintain that performance when they're up against the best international competition in the world. And in the same vein, teams that have started off a little slower, making a comeback towards the end of the year to qualify to these events, get to the grand finals. But again, just that lack of playing time, that lack of experience playing against these fresh, updated rosters will come back to cost them. And unfortunately, we're saying goodbye to 17 Gaming, FaZe Clan, GK Esports, Daytrade, All Gamers Global, and Furia as our bottom 8 teams for the PGC grand finals. So as we head towards the top 8, from 5th place down to 8th, we will have Team Liquid, The Expendables, Falcons, and Na'Vi. This already just feels like some insanely strong teams. And to get to this point, especially for a team like Team Liquid, who started off with coming heartbreakingly close to qualifying, but just not quite getting over the line. This is still a pretty successful year for them to get to this spot, but for them, it will be a disappointing year. They came so close to getting a title so many times last year, but fell just short at every one, despite some insane individual performances. And unfortunately for them, I have it happening once again. For a team like the Expendables, no one really expected them to be PGC champions, but all the prize money that they've had from that has been invested extremely well. They've got brand new facilities, new coaching staff, and the vibes over in Hanoi are just consistently immaculate. But by the power of friendship and Buncha, they will make it to the top 6. But unfortunately, they're not going for the back-to-back PGC championships this time, as they will be bested by the top 4 teams, which will include Virtus Pro and Twisted Minds. A big year for EMEA on the cards for sure, but unfortunately it's gonna be that same familiar story again, where Batulins and the boys look really good, look really consistent, but this time the competition that has been built up around the world is just a little too stiff for them, and it will be another year of maybe winning PGS titles, but that PGC trophy is going to continue to elude them, which leaves us with our final 2 teams. So my prediction for the final 2 at PGC 2025 at the end of this year is a 2nd place finish for Petrichor Road and a championship for DN Freaks. Yeah, boy! Salute, salute, salute. Nah, he's kind of insane. He's cracked. He really is the only part of that PGC winning Danawa roster that is still just going, showing no signs of slowing down, and if anything, building momentum. And even with some roster changes that have occurred since last year under KDF, they've done nothing but grow even more dominant regionally. And I really think there's just going to be no one who can really slow them down. Petrichor Road, with their roster changes that they have made, will have a massive uptick in performance as well. Would not at all be surprised to see Ixleft dropping MVP quality numbers at PGC. And don't get me wrong, that is still no easy feat when you have elite level players competing from all around the world. But there's just something about DN Freaks, man. That quality, teamwork, cohesion, they have it all. And my way too early prediction for PGC 2025 is that they're going to win it all. If you are like me and you are a fortunate soul who can see 7 months into the future and you have your own predictions, please let me know. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What would be your way too early prediction for who will be the champions of PGC 2025? Let me know down below in the comments how you think. But most importantly, have a great time watching PGS 7 and 8. I have been given the green light to do watch parties as well, which is lovely. So I'll hopefully be streaming as much as possible on my Twitch channel and here on the YouTube channel. So do remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. And also, if you do think I'm an idiot for these predictions, or if you don't, either way, give us a like. It would be much appreciated, because sadly I'm watching from home this year. I'm not traveling. So if you guys could kindly donate me enough of your thumbs up, I might be able to take them to the grocery store and convince them to let me buy food so I can actually eat. So that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!